Hello, Jacksonites. I'm not canceling or pausing Super Kaiju Binge. My new schedule with Super Kaiju Binge is it's gonna happen when it happens, but if there's a video that I want to do in between episodes of Super Kaiju Binge, I'm just gonna do it. So don't fret. This is something that is something I've wanted to do for a little while now, but also count this video as a prelude to another video that I'm going to be doing um, at the end of this month. So look forward to that. But yes, today I wanted to have a guest for this, but this was just so short notice that nobody was able to prepare. Recently, I managed to get my hands on the entire Nightmare on Elm Street collection. As I stated, I believe in my top 20 favorite horror movies video, lately I've been feeling the need to expand my collection and just get some fresh stuff into my life. And one thing that I've been eyeing for a while is the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Partially because specifically for this pack, this has the first 8 movies in one set, and this was only like $20. So I just figured, you know what, may as well get my hands on this. This is a pretty good deal if you ask me. So yeah, what the hell? And I got my hands on it, and I think I've said this before. I have a general rule: any new movie that I buy that I've never seen before, I watch it at least once. And I tend to usually have a pretty big checklist of movies that I buy, but I never get around to watching. But been trying to crack down on that list lately, and I only have a few left. And while I didn't really apply that rule to this, because a lot of these movies I already have seen, 2 of them, Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and 6, are the 2 Nightmare on Elm Street movies I still had not seen until yesterday. I finally got around to seeing 5 and 6. Sure. I guess you could include Child's Play in with the canon of Nightmare on Elm Street. Why not? Um, but yeah, I got my hands on a Nightmare on Elm Street collection, watched 5 and 6, and have now firmly cemented my thoughts on the Nightmare on Elm Street series. The Nightmare on Elm Street series is, of course, one of the big 3 of horror movie franchises, even though I think there should be 5 with Child's Play, specifically of slashers, with Child's Play and Texas Chainsaw Massacre thrown in as the other 2. But the big 3 being, of course, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Halloween. Sadly, Halloween is the only one to get new installments since 2010. I think in general, of all 3 franchises, Halloween is the one that's the most successful. Nightmare on Elm Street is definitely my least favorite of the 3 big horror movie franchises. It has the least amount of installments. It has the least amount of kills. And just in general, it tends to have the ones of all 3 franchises that I like the least. Though, not to say that I dislike the Nightmare on Elm Street series entirely, I actually used to be very anti Nightmare on Elm Street at one point. It just, to me, for the longest time, paled in comparison to Friday and Halloween. It still kind of does, because as I've said, this is my least favorite of the big 3. Although if I was to throw in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Child's Play, Texas Chainsaw Massacre would be my least favorite of those 5, but we're not. But I still do say Nightmare on Elm Street is just not quite as good as Friday and Halloween. Even though Friday and Halloween, they have their moments where there's bad movies and then there's also good ones. The Nightmare on Elm Street series just was not well handled for a good chunk of its franchise. They saw the series purely just as a cash cow, which Paramount certainly treated Friday the 13th as a cash cow. for a good chunk of the series. For the first 8 movies, they were cranking out almost one movie a year. But there was still at least a consistent level of quality over the first 8 films, even though it did go downhill pretty quickly toward the last 2. With the Nightmare on Elm Street series, it fluctuates drastically from installment to installment. Now, I'm not quite as anti Nightmare on Elm Street as I used to be. I really think there's only 3 movies that are bad and one that is just kind of strongly hit or miss. But now, as a more mature horror movie fan, I now do greatly appreciate the Nightmare on Elm Street series more than I used to. It definitely is probably the most distinct and unique and memorable of the 3 big horror movie franchises. Friday the 13th, you can just label them as big budget B movies. Halloween is an entirely different entity in and of itself. It's kind of hard to, well, I mean, it's a slasher movie franchise, but it's also just a big giant convoluted mess. But well, no, he couldn't even say that. But a lot of the movies is just Michael going around killing his family, and then with Friday, a lot of those movies is just Jason killing people that show up in his territory. But with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, it does always differ wildly from film to film. It's not just Freddy going around killing more kids of parents that killed him from movie to movie to movie to movie. Well, the first 3 movies kind of do, well, the first 4, because 2 doesn't really do that, do kind of do that, and it gets a bit stale at that point, but then it turns off in a different direction. What I'm trying to get at is I appreciate the Nightmare on Elm Street series more than I used to. It still is my least favorite. But one thing I will also say, Freddy Krueger is he is the most entertaining because he actually has a voice and a personality. He's also the most evil of all 3. Like, he actually has nasty, sick, sinister personality quirks to him. Whereas Michael and especially Jason, sometimes they can be somewhat sympathetic. Freddy is just a straight up, out and out little shit asshole piece of shit villain. And that, I think that makes him villain wise the most interesting of all 3. It's just a shame that with a lot of installments he wasn't handled all that well. So now that I've seen the entire Nightmare on Elm Street series, I've decided that I'm going to rank them from my least favorite to favorite. I will be including Freddy versus Jason. I figure why not, because it really is more of a Nightmare on Elm Street movie than it is a Friday the 13th movie when you break it down to brass tacks. Even though it does have a good chunk of Friday the 13th stuff in it, Freddy is the main. It's kind of like with Alien versus Predator. The Predators are in it, but you can definitely say that's more of an Alien movie than it is a Predator film. Partially because the aliens are the main antagonistic threat. Same case in Freddy versus Jason. It is mostly a Nightmare on Elm Street movie over a Friday the 13th film. So yeah, I will be including Freddy versus Jason, and I will, of course, also be including the 2010 remake. That movie's placement might surprise a lot of people. So without further ado, let us get into the rankings of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Coming in at number 9, oh my God, is Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. A weird, convoluted, boring, uninspired piece of shit mess. 1989 was the year of the 3 what year was it was the year when all 3 of the slasher movie franchises released an installment in their franchise. There was, of course, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, Halloween 5, the Revenge of Michael Myers, and of course Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. And all three of them suck ass. And in two of them, it's the worst of the entire franchise. Nightmare on Elm Street 5 is just an absolute train wreck piece of boring ass garbage. There's only 3 kills in the entire movie. That's another reason why I'm just not a big fan of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It doesn't have the biggest body count. It gets as low as 2 or 3 kills a movie, and of all 3 big franchises, it has the smallest body count with only 43 or 4 kills for the entire franchise. The fuck? Whereas Friday the 13th has like 120 to 130 kills, and Halloween I think has maybe 80 or 90 kills. Poor Nightmare on Elm Street's just sitting there looking puny. But 3 kills in a 90-minute movie. Lame. It also has an incredibly nonsensical story. Freddie using a infant fetus's dreams to bring himself back to life. I'm a father. Pretty damn sure a fetus doesn't dream like how dreams are portrayed in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I don't give a shit what spin you could put on that. It makes no sense for a baby to dream like that in order to bring back a dream demon. Just what the fuck? Also, all of the characters are carbon copies of the cast from Nightmare on Elm Street 4, but they're all annoying, bland, and boring. They have 2 perks to them that makes them distinctive. She likes to swim, and she's a nurse. She has an overprotecting mother, and she's a model. He doesn't like blood, and he draws comics. Whoop-de-fucking-do. None of them are none of them are interesting. None of them are fun to watch. None of them are engaging as characters. Lisa Wilcox is okay as returning Alice from Nightmare on Elm Street 4, but she's just not nearly as charismatic or as entertaining as she is in Nightmare 4. She also doesn't feel as confident or badass as she was at the ending of Nightmare on Elm Street 4. And not only does this movie only have 3 kills, but man, is this movie tame. The first kill of the movie being Dan, Alice's boyfriend, him transforming into a human motorcycle machine hybrid, looks cool, but there's not much blood. I'm pretty sure this movie was royally slaughtered by the MPAA. Also, when the comic book guy is killed, there's no blood. He's turned into a comic book character and shredded like a paper machine. And the third chick is, I mean, it looks gross, but the third chick just overeats herself to death, and there's barely any blood. Word from our sponsor. And the biggest sin of all, just in general, with Nightmare on Elm Street 5, it's boring. I've said this many times. The biggest sin that a movie can do is if it's boring. And man, is this movie boring. There's not one scene in this movie that I find entertaining or enjoyable. It's just all boring, nonsensical bullshit drivel. Another thing, too, is that the special effects are wildly inconsistent in this film. Sometimes they look pretty decent, like when that one chick gets overeaten to death. Those effects are gross and nasty. And then there's others where the chick is dealing with stop motion MTV Go motion stuff, and it just looks cartoony and not scary in the slightest. Also, a lot of the composite shots are not very convincing. A lot of the sets are poorly edited, and the kills are poorly edited. The The Dan motorcycle kill looks great, but the MPAA cut it to pieces, so you can't really appreciate it for what it is. Yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 is just an utterly boring, drivelous, terrible, terrible piece of shit garbage. I hated this movie. It was boring, it was awful, and it was tedious and terrible. Holy shit, I hated this movie. Coming in at number 8 is Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. A lot of people put this either at the second, well, yeah, me, or most commonly they list it as the worst Nightmare on Elm Street movie. The hell? Oh, that's what it is. It's a battery. I can see why, but ultimately, the best thing that I can say about this movie, one, it's got some good Freddy Krueger backstory. Like we see more of his time as the Springwood slasher rather than just being the dream demon. So that's fun to see. And the word has been spoken. At least there's gore. There's more blood than there was in the fifth film. And I'll admit, there were a couple of scenes that I did find funny, like Freddie listing off all the ways that he died. First, they tried burning me. Then they tried burying me. They even tried holy water. But I just keep on ticking. I found that scene funny. And I'll admit, when Spence, the video game pothead, was killed and he's being controlled and jumping and zipping and hooting and hollering all over the house, destroying it like a video game character, I thought it was funny. It's not scary, and you can't take this movie seriously at all. And man, is it a far cry from the scary roots that this franchise started in. But at least it was funny. And just overall, there were some scenes in this movie that I did find to be funny. Also, overall, the movie wasn't boring. Also, this movie has some pretty inconsistent effects, but this one didn't feel nearly as, because that's another thing about Part 5. It was rushed. So that's another reason why it didn't feel that, it felt pretty kind of soulless. This movie didn't feel nearly as rushed as parts 4 and 5 did. Even then, part 4 at least had some actual effort put into it. And you can tell that the filmmakers were trying to be a little bit more ambitious with this movie's story, like having Freddy's influence be so vast that he turned Springwood, Ohio pretty much into a living nightmare. That's a cool concept, but in the end, it's just too comical, too silly, too goofy, and too aimed at children to be taken seriously as a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. Also, Freddy's got a pretty lame-ass death in this film. The 3D effects are pointless, dumb, and stupid. All the acting and characters are just bad and terrible. They come off as being a ripoff of Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Like you pretty much could call, I can't remember her name, but the Don't Touch Me chick as like an angry version of Kristen from Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Another thing too is that, again, this movie has a bit of a bigger body count than Nightmare on Elm Street 5, and there's more blood and gore and more creative kills. And also, Freddy doesn't feel so much like an automaton that like he did in Part 5. He actually has a little bit of character to himself in this movie. And introducing the concept that Freddy had a daughter, I do like. It's just a shame the actress doesn't do a good job playing her. Freddy's dead. And Freddy's fucking makeup in this movie looks absolutely terrible. It looks like bubble gum. It's just bad and terrible and ugly and very non-flattering. Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare is a train wreck, and it is just a total joke to the Nightmare on Elm Street series. But in the end, I didn't really hate it. Um, I think part of it is because I knew what I was getting into watching Nightmare on Elm Street Part 6. So I just kind of took the movie for what it was, but I can see that it is a bad movie, but it's not as bad as Nightmare on Elm Street 5. So take that for what you will. Coming in at number 7 is Nightmare on Elm Street 4. This suffers from a lot of the same issues as Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and kind of Nightmare on Elm Street 6. To quote Josh from Movie Timelines, his dead last episode on the Nightmare on Elm Street series, I agree with something that his wife said. 4, 5, and 6 are pretty much the same shit show to me. Yeah, I agree. 4, 5, and 6 all suffer from a lot of the same issues. New Line Cinema was treating this not necessarily as a horror fantasy series. They were just treating it as a cash cow. And they were buying into their popularity way too quickly, way too much. This is the beginning of that, and it starts full force and it hits the ground running with this film. Though Nightmare on Elm Street 4 does have some good things going for it. It's got a really bitchin' soundtrack. Robert Englund, he's not scary as Freddie, but he is a bit more threatening and intimidating in this film still. And you can tell that he's having fun and he's not just the one-liner spewing automaton that he was in 5 and parts of 6. He's actually still a pretty decent three-dimensional character in this movie. Even though the one-liners and the jokiness is just brought up to a T, it's still done with some malicious intent, at least to me. The best thing that I can say about Nightmare on Elm Street 4, it's got some phenomenal special effects. Like Freddy's resurrection looks really good. It's a wax bust of Freddy that was reverse melted on camera, and that looks really good. There's not a whole lot of blood, but there is still some pretty gross kills. The best of all being when that one chick is morphed into a cockroach. The effects on that are gross and slimy and gnarly and disgusting. And of course, Freddy's death in this movie, when all the souls inside of him start bursting out of his body and ripping his body to shreds, that effect is really good. So overall, the special effects in this movie are really, really solid. Some of the best of the whole franchise, if you ask me. Outside of that, though, Nightmare on Elm Street 4 has a giant list of problems. Patricia Arquette is recast as Tuesday Night for Kristen. She doesn't work. She looks uncomfortable and she looks bored and just doesn't have an ounce of the charisma that Patricia Arquette had in Nightmare on Elm Street 3. All of the returning likable characters from part 4 are killed off pretty damn quickly as the movie begins, almost pulling an Alien 3. And the cast of characters that they replace them with in this movie, aside from Lisa Wilcox, are boring, bland, annoying, and stupid. Also, the story just lacks really a big through line. It just feels like Freddy going around killing kids randomly and indiscriminately at this point. Like, whoop-de-doo. Yeah, this movie is just, it's not that great. It's got great effects and a great soundtrack, and it has moments when it's entertaining. Like, especially when Alice like fully realizes her dream powers and she goes and whips the shit out of Freddy. That's entertaining and all, but it almost is too little too late. Although there is one unintentionally funny moment with Alice where when she first discovers her dream powers, she inherits her ability to fight with karate because her brother Rick was a karate master and she inherited his abilities. And then there's a scene when she's swinging around nunchucks. Hi, Terry. And you can tell whenever it's a camera shot from her from the back, it's a fucking dude wearing a wig. Why? They had millions of dollars on this movie. Why couldn't, like, if they didn't want Alice to actually be the one swinging the nunchucks, why couldn't they use a female stunt double? Why did they need to use a dude in a wig? Like, what the fuck? And then there's another scene later in the movie where, again, emulating her brother, Alice is climbing her way out of her house, and it's a dude wearing drag and a wig. Like, what the fuck? Again, did you not just want to use her? Why couldn't you use a female stunt double? Why a dude in a wig? Why? Uh, yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street 4. It's not a great movie. It has a couple moments. I feel like this was the last time for a while the Nightmare on Elm Street movies were trying to be good. Um, yeah, it just doesn't work for me. Now we're on to easily the most controversial pick. Usually this is at the very bottom of everybody's list, but at number 6 comes Nightmare on Elm Street 2010. This movie has a lot of problems. But I think there are quite a bit of things that went into this movie that people either overlook or choose to overlook and just say it's a bad movie. Now, in many ways, maybe a 1 or 2 for Scream. It's a big meta joke on the slasher movies format or formula. It's a big celebration of slasher movies. It has some moments of suspense and maybe a couple of jump scares, but Scream is more fun than it is scary. If you're a big slasher movie fan, you'll appreciate all the Easter eggs and jokes that goes into Scream. So you'll probably really like Scream. Anyway, Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 has a lot of problems, but I think there's things that people overlook. Or I already said that, but now Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 does have a lot of problems. The acting and characters are all, for the most part, pretty damn lifeless and soulless. No, with the exception of Jackie Earle Haley and maybe the guy who plays the principal in this movie, Mr. Krabs, he looks like he's trying, and Jackie Earle Haley is certainly trying. I'll get to him in a little bit. Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 has one of the biggest sleepwalking cast of characters I've ever seen. Rooney Mara looks absolutely bored and disinterested. Her mom's actress looks bored. Her boyfriend's actor looks bored. I can't remember his name, but yeah, all the acting and all of the characters just look so bored and disinterested and lethargic and sluggish in this movie. It's not even funny. A lot of them also look like they're about to cry or break down because they just don't want to be here. The special effects are wildly inconsistent. You have moments of decent, gory practical effects, and then you have the new version of Freddy coming out of the wall, which looks like a horrendous fucking CGI PS3 cutscene. Even back in 2010, I am a big CGI guy. Like, I support the use of CGI. But if you're using CGI, make it look good and not look super cartoony and fake like Freddy coming out of the wall in this movie. The story too feels like the filmmakers wanted to be ballsy and controversial, because a good chunk of the movie feels like the filmmakers wanted to have Freddy be innocent this whole time. But then at the last minute, because the movie for a good chunk of it pretty much is a mystery film, but then to have the mystery build up to the revelation that this whole time Freddy actually was a pedophile and he's seeking revenge on the kids, they treat it like it's a big reveal, but we've already known this whole time that Freddy was a child killer. Now, in the original series, I am aware it was more so implied that there was some kind of pedophilic aspects to Freddy Krueger in the original series, but the only thing that's explicitly stated is that he was a child killer, not a child molester. Not to defend those actions at all, don't get me wrong. And also Wes Craven wanted to go with that initially, but because of a topical subject at the time, he decided to remove that aspect because he didn't want to come off as being um what's the word? Insensitive. So he removed those elements and this movie went with those elements. Um in that aspect, I kind of get the feeling they were trying to be a bit more ballsy to make Freddy more despicable, but at the same time a little bit more relatable because of his relationship with Nancy. But I actually really do wish they could have gone with that route of having Freddy be innocent. It would have changed around quite a bit of this movie, if you ask me. But they didn't, and they didn't do that because they didn't want to be so different and be even more controversial. Another thing about this movie is that it does feel very soulless. It feels like no passion or drive went into making this movie. Like none of that from the original Nightmare on Elm Street. This just felt like a gig that someone was just paid to do, and that's it, which was kind of true. The Sam Bayer, I think his name is, this movie's director, was a music uh um I keep losing track. Fuck. Oh yeah, Samuel Bayer is a music video guy. He makes music videos. And for some reason, um, Michael Bay was so hell bent on having a music video director make this movie, and this is the only movie that Samuel Bayer has ever made. Okay, I guess his heart just really wasn't in it. Um, Going back to the effects too, one thing that hurts this movie a lot as well is copying the original, like recreating a lot of the original movie's most famous scenes. The chick flying above the bed and getting slashed across her chest. Um, the body bag in the hallway, the Freddy's glove coming out of the bathtub and Freddy coming out of the wall. It's not quite like the 98 Psycho, but it does come off as being stale. Though I will say, when Tina dies, I think her name's Tina, when the Tina equivalent in this movie dies, I will say that the blood, I think, looks better in the 2010 version than it does in the original. The slash and the blood just spray out all over the place, and it looks a lot more violent and visceral. So let me actually get to the things that I think the movie does do better. It does make better use of its effects when they're practical. The practical effects in this movie, I think, actually do look really, really, really solid. When the body bag is in the hallway, it's bloody and nasty and visceral and disgusting looking. The dream sequences are also done really good. Like going in and out of the dream world and the real world. That effect is done very well. And also when I think his name's Dan, I think when he's killed in the prison, that is a really gnarly ass looking kill. There's blood that's spraying all over the place. Freddy's arm and his glove are slathered in blood when he pulls his hand through. Um, just in general, in this movie, the kills are a lot more violent and bloody, and they're a lot of fun to watch. Hands down, the best thing you can say about this movie is Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy Krueger. Um, He's great in my opinion. I have a pitch for a future Nightmare on Elm Street movie. I think a really good actor to play Freddy Krueger would be Willem Dafoe, the guy who played Green Goblin in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. He's got the height. He's about 5'8". He's got the old man skin and face. He's got the eyes and the teeth and the crazy smile. And if he was to use his Green Goblin voice and laugh for Freddy Krueger, I think he would be a phenomenal Freddy Krueger. But Jackie Earle Haley also does do, in my opinion, a really good job as Freddy. He's got the look and the appearance and physique for Freddy. Short, small, skinny, scrawny, kind of older and creepy looking dude. He's got the voice. It sounds a little bit like Rorschach from Watchmen, but still, that voice is a good villain voice. He has that sick, sinister sense of humor to him still, but it's a lot. The menace and seriousness is cranked up a lot more than in previous Freddys. He also does laugh. He laughs at appropriate times, if you ask me, and he's got appropriate one-liners like the wet dream line, or let's see, what's another one? Like how about we hang first, hanging dead bodies from the boiler room. And just overall, I feel Freddie I can't talk. Jackie Earle Haley was doing a really, really good job with what he had as Freddy Krueger. More could have been done with him, certainly, but I think what we have is a lot better than what most people give him credit for. Overall, Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 is a gigantic mixed bag. There's a lot of elements in this movie that are absolutely terrible and really hurt this movie in the long run. But I think there are some things in this movie that are done quite well, including the micronaps thing. That's a really cool concept, but not a whole lot's done with it. That could have made this movie a lot better than it could have been. But just it was studio decisions that really hurt this movie. And this movie was so badly I don't think that's true. Not nearly as much as Jack Nicholson. And this movie was so badly revered and so badly received. Still to this day, the Nightmare on Elm Street series is just sitting in limbo. All right, now we're getting into the good stuff. Though the least of which being Nightmare on Elm Street 2 coming in at number 5. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, I actually used to consider to be the worst of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Now that I've actually rewatched it, it's a pretty interesting installment. It's flawed, but to quote Decker's Shadow, it's not necessarily a bad movie, nor is it a bad, well, it is a bad Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but I also wouldn't say that either, because Freddy in this movie is done really, really, really well. This is probably the darkest and scariest Freddy almost of the entire series, but certainly before Freddy versus Jason, this was probably the darkest and meanest Freddy. The creepy haunted house possession vibe that this movie has may not entirely be Nightmare on Elm Street centric, but it still is effective to make this movie scary and serious. The special effects are also pretty solid. There's lots of good blood and gore, and there's lots of decent kills. And the story overall, it's like a one-off Elseworld story, but it is still intriguing and interesting. There's not much to say about Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Oh, and at least for me. But yeah, the homoerotic subtext of this movie sticks out like a sore thumb and is just like a big head scratcher. Like, why would you insert this into a Nightmare on Elm Street movie? And like, there's the supposed subtext of Freddie symbolizing a gay man's sexuality in the closet or something along those lines. Like, what? Huh? Why is that here? Um, I know it sounds like I might be picking on Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I'm really not. Of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies I do like, it is my least favorite, but that's not totally a bad thing. It has a lot of good things going for it, and it is an entertaining film. It still does, for the most part, feel like a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, at least. Um, and it's one of those rare times where the main character is a man instead of a woman. And Mark Patton does a really, really good job as Jesse. Um, Overall, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 it's a fun movie. It's not as good as its predecessor. And I guess you could kind of say it's one of the weaker installments in terms of being a true Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but it's still interesting and entertaining nonetheless. Coming in at number 4 is the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I used to honestly hate this movie. I thought it was boring and dull and poorly made and just not that good of a Freddy movie. But then I actually sat down and rewatched it with an older mindset, and yeah, this is a pretty decent movie. It's for a $1.8 million budget, this movie is made pretty well. It's got a really interesting and intriguing concept. This actually probably is the second darkest and meanest Freddy of the whole series. No, I believe that horror movies are an outlet for people with violent tendencies to get those out. Harmlessly watching people being killed in movies and TV is a way for someone to satisfy those urges and not take them out on society. So, no, I don't. Um, and this has a pretty decent cast of kids. Weird watching this movie now and seeing a 20-year-old Johnny Depp in this movie. um, oh man, it's so strange seeing Johnny Depp as he is now, and then going back to 1984 and seeing Johnny Depp then. He probably weighed 90 pounds back then. He was a skinny, young, shrimp ass little turd. Um, Now he still does a good job in the movie, though. He's a good male supporting character, and he probably gives the most iconic death in the entire movie when he's sucked into the bed and a giant geyser of blood is gushed out of his bed. Ooh, that's gnarly. Great musical score. That's one thing about the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's always got pretty distinctive music. Um, And of course, the originals music done by Charles Bernstein, I think, is distinctive 80s, but also scary and iconic. Um, Hands down, the highlight of the movie is Heather Langenkamp as Nancy. She's awesome. Even though she was only 20 in this movie, she gives it her all and she gives a damn fine performance. She's a very, very good final girl to grow attached to, especially with her implementing booby traps all over her house to get Freddie, like a shotgun shell into a light bulb, a hooked up sledgehammer to smash into Freddie's chest. Um, yeah, there's some good booby traps in this movie, and she actually is willing to put up a fight against her villain, which is respectable. Um, Yeah, this movie's pretty good. It's not nearly as bad as I initially thought it was. Though I will say it's a little frustrating. I know this was the first of its kind, but I definitely do agree with James A. Janice. This movie retroactively suffers from Freddie being utilized so little in this movie. Freddie only has 7 minutes of screen time in this entire movie. Now, his presence is felt throughout the film, especially with the characters all being afraid to go to sleep. That aspect is well done. And when he is on screen, he makes a good impression. But with the sequels establishing Freddy as the character that he is, going back to basics and the underutilization of your franchise's villain, it's a little frustrating because you expect there to be more when this movie just doesn't give it. But still, Freddy is well done in this movie, and he is scary and creepy and intimidating and threatening. And it's not ultimately a huge issue, but overall, yeah, the original Nightmare on Elm Street, it's a solid horror fantasy movie. It certainly is different, and you can feel the passion and drive and um, want to make a movie come out with this film because Wes Craven was a new and upcoming filmmaker at the time. He wanted to make this movie, and he found his opportunity, and boy, did he make it, and it paid off like crazy. Coming in at number 3 is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This is prototype Scream, and I kind of agree with what Steven here says. Wes Craven's New Nightmare shares the same continuity as Scream. I can see that, especially since they both have the same director, and they're both meta horror movies. Whereas Scream is a celebration of the slasher genre as a whole. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, it being an anniversary movie coming out in 1994, is a celebration of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and Freddy Krueger himself as a whole. If you are a Nightmare on Elm Street fan, specifically a Heather Langenkamp original Nightmare and Nightmare 3 fan, you will dig the shit out of this movie. It's very original, it's well told, it's well made, it's tense, riveting, gritty, and thrilling. The only issue that I have with this movie, there's not a whole lot of Freddy screen time. And also, there's not that big of a body count. I think this has only 4 kills, and 2 of them are very nostalgia homage driven. And that's a little bit of a shame. I also don't care for Freddy's hat. His new overall look is really good. His trench coat, his 5 clawed fingers, his boots, and his overall outfit look great, and his makeup looks great too. It's just his hat. His green brand new fedora just sticks out like a sore thumb and doesn't blend well with the rest of his outfit. But not a whole lot to say about Wes Craven's New Nightmare. It's a damn solid movie and a damn fine movie, in my opinion. If you're a big Nightmare on Elm Street fan, I think you'll dig the shit out of Wes Craven's New Nightmare. It's a very, very good movie. Coming in at number 2 is Nightmare on Elm Street 3. I've already talked about this one quite a bit. This is the best of pure Freddy. It's the best mix of horror and scares. There's moments that are scary and violent and gory and bloody, and there's other moments that are whimsical and fantastical and hilarious. This is it, Jennifer. Your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch. Crash. Probably the most iconic kill of the entire Nightmare on Elm Street series. Freddy is awesome in this movie, but above all else, this movie overall, I think, has the best cast of kid characters. They're all relatable, funny, entertaining, and likable. They all have their own distinct personality. They all have their moments to shine, and they're all relatable and fun. I'll say the one thing about this movie that I don't like is Nancy dying. It kind of comes out of nowhere. It feels rushed, anticlimactic, and pointless. But outside of that, Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is a fun-ass, badass, great time. Not jumping on the bandwagon, believe me, I'm not, because this one is just such a big fan favorite. But Nightmare on Elm Street 3 truly is a masterpiece film. But what the hell else do you think is number one? Freddy versus Jason. I've stated this many, many times. Freddy versus Jason is the best of both worlds. So we'll specifically talk about Freddy in this film. This is Robert Englund's best performance as Freddy Krueger, the best looking makeup and overall costume for Freddy. He's got his best lines, his best voice, and his best antagonistic role of the entire Nightmare on Elm Street series. He is lacking with kills, yes, but like with the original Nightmare on Elm Street, still his presence is felt throughout a good chunk of the film. Also, his fights with Jason in this movie are badass and entertaining and awesome. And I think this movie just overall has the best mix of digital and practical effects of both Friday and Nightmare. Freddy vs. Jason is a masterpiece. I love this movie to death. It's one of my favorite horror films and just movies of all time. So that'll do it for my ranking of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's overall still an interesting horror movie franchise. It is my least favorite of the big three, but I still do recommend you check it out, especially since it being Halloween, everyone's entitled to one good scare. So post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button, and share this video with your friends. And as always, if you fall asleep and you see a dude with finger knives and a gray or a green and red sweater coming towards you, just wake up. And I'll see you guys in the next video.